And I'm sorry, but a lot of people out there have been so brainwashed by television that all you have to do is change what's on the TV to change their minds, you know?
Sure.
But I have provided tape recordings and photographs and videos and various proofs to assorted police and investigative agencies. So, you know, I don't really need to prove myself at this point, although if there's a legitimate criticism, I'm happy to answer it.
Oh, I understand that. One question that I'd like to edify here. When we see videos of you in Japan, there's been, on at least 3 videos I'm aware of, you're appearing with a man who seems to have, he's carrying a walking stick and he has kind of a raspy voice. So who is this guy and what's his connection? Because most people don't speak Japanese. They have no idea what's going on.
His name is Chodoin Daikaku, okay?
Okay.
And he controls the world's martial arts societies. So he's the head of the karate associations, the aikido associations. Now there's a couple like the judo and the Chinese martial arts that they don't he's not the head of them, but he knows the guys who run them. So he's a bigwig. You know, he's not just some flake.
Okay. When you say he controls the karate association,
well, he's the head of the organizations.
Okay, so how many schools and how many people are we talking about that he'd be working with?
I think there are like 50 million people worldwide studying Japanese martial arts. You know, they have karate schools in Mexico and Iran and, you know, wherever.
Sure,
so
but
we're talking very big organizations
But
here.
couldn't anybody just open a karate school without accreditation? Or are you saying there is an accreditation and that he's at the head of that accrediting agency?
Well, if they opened a karate school, they probably got a black belt or something, okay? And they did that by going to some teacher affiliated with this organization.
I see. So there is some sort of centralized authority that you have to appeal to if you want to run a karate school.
Well, if you want to get a belt, you have to study, you know, at one of these accredited schools, yeah.
I see.
So
nobody could just hang out a sign and say, here's a karate school, here's your black belt, and have you be taken seriously if you wanted to go to a martial arts tournament and actually compete.
Well, I mean, it's a meritocracy, so if you just, you know, put on a black belt and go to these tournaments and beat people's ass, they'll recognize you.
Okay. But within Japan, maybe in particular, let's say, this guy that you were referring to, Chodoin Daikaku, he is sort of like the kingpin of martial arts groups in Japan.
Yeah, I made your kingpin, let's put it that way.
Now,
and he's also connected to the Japanese self-defense forces. But what you need to realize is that most of the guys I talk to don't want their name or picture out there at all.
Sure, absolutely.
They refuse to let me name them or put out their photograph. But I have introduced them to MI6 CIA types, and at that level they do communicate, okay?
I know that it's hard to pin you down time-wise. Could you paint for the average listener what your day is like? I mean, how many insiders, how many different people do you think you talk to in a given week right now?
It really depends. But basically, what happens now is I talk to people who are connected to large organizations. Okay. So, I have one guy I talk to who I know has, strong Pentagon CIA connections. Okay. And then there's another guy I talk to who's definitely Rothschild MI6 connected British royal family type. Okay. And I've confirmed independently these people that, you know, through multiple sources that they're real. Okay.
Sure.
And then there's another guy who I talked to who would be connected to the Japanese right-wing groups as well as the Asian secret societies. And then there's this Chodoin guy I talk to. And then less often, for example, I talk to senior people of the Japanese gangs, like the Yamaguchi-gumi or the Inagawa-kai or the Sumiyoshi. And there's a guy I talk to who's a KGB Serbian intelligence type I talk to quite regularly.
From Russia or from Serbia?
He's from, originally from Serbia. Okay, I should say more than that.
Right. I don't want to betray your sources at all, so, yeah.
But for example, I know I've gone out drinking with the wife of Prime Minister Khan Naoto many times. She lives in my neighborhood.
Wow.
There's a lot of people I know. So, there has been, though, and I'll mention this, there's been a very, very intensive campaign to make me seem like a flake.
Sure.
And they have a book about as thick as a phone book, a file on me. And they, first of all, they tried to kill me. And then when they realized that there was protection behind me, and that would mean whoever ordered the kill would be killed themselves in retaliation. The next, they tried to drive me into bankruptcy by blacklisting me. And when that didn't work.
Well, hold on. What do you mean blacklist?
Okay, I used to have regular TV shows in Japan, and I had.
Oh, you did?
Oh yeah, a big primetime shows, and I was able
like
to
on
publish,
NHK or what network?
NHK had a 20-minute special on me in prime time. I had various networks, but the point is, I was also able to publish stories in places that major Western media, but you know, I got put on a blacklist.
Around what time was that? What year?
That would happen, I guess it started around 2005, 2006 after I left Forbes and started writing stuff about 911.
Yeah.
That would be about it.
So 9/11 was your first major book that you put out? Was that was your first book?
Magazine articles. And then I was holding press conference at the Foreign Correspondents Club explaining why I was writing about 911, you know, just trying to get publicity in the Western media. And that's when I realized that either they were scared of losing their jobs or they were working for some agency and only pretending to be a journalist, and that the media was controlled. I mean, I already knew it was controlled, but I didn't know how thoroughly controlled it was until I had press conferences about 911 and presented the evidence. And well, now, people like the New York Times correspondent telling me that he would be fired if he wrote about this, you know.
So your opinion about 9/11 is obviously not Arabs with box cutters. What could you synopsize what was your conclusion that got you in so much trouble? You're obviously not supporting the official dogma around 9/11.
Well, I think the short story is that it's that slogan. It was an inside job. The problem, you know, the evidence is overwhelming, you know, that it wasn't done by a small group of Saudi terrorists with box cutters. But the problem that most people encounter is that if it wasn't, then the implications are so mind-boggling because it involved such a large amount of people and so much planning and so many insiders that people go into a state of denial. Such a conspiracy was too large to be possible. And they just, their minds shut it off.
Well, I also, my major in college was psychology, and I went through a suicide hotline internship, so I have the equivalent of master's just from education. And we learned, especially in crisis counseling, we learned about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
And what it turns out is that when somebody's been traumatized heavily, they create a dissociative partition in their mind. It's like a separate personality that handles the trauma.
Yeah.
And they get very defensive, and typically if you tell them information that brings up that PTSD, that triggers their trauma, they will attack the messenger because the trauma is so severe that they will do anything not to actually re-experience it.
In any case, if you go back to the history, you realize that, you know, that they've always had to create fake incidents in order to get people fired up into war. This is, you know, You go back to historical cases, and people don't have that trauma associated with it. For example, if you look at why the Spanish-American War started, you'll realize it was a fake incident, the blowing up the ship, the Maine,
right,
and blaming it on Spain. Nice headline rhyme there, eh?
Yeah.
And then 70 years later, they say, actually, we blew it up ourselves,
Right.
Well, if we were at the time saying it was done by the Americans, they would have lynched you on the street,
You mentioned a mind-blowing piece of information about the Titanic.
Yeah, I mean, that was, remember a book came out a year before about a ship called the Titan that sank on its maiden voyage, and
right.
They got rid of, in one fell swoop, about 600 industrialists who were opposed to the taking over the Fed, and J.P. Morgan was saying, hey, let's all talk about it while we cross the Atlantic, and of course he missed his ship at the last moment, and they were prevented at gunpoint from boarding the lifeboats,
Well, there's a lot
of stuff that's going to come out, but the conclusion I've reached, and it's really quite mind-boggling, is that the story goes back to Sabbatai Zev, a self-described messiah of the Jews who lived in Turkey about 300 and some years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he was the Messiah, and that it was the job of the Jews themselves to carry out the prophecies of the Torah, and that we shouldn't wait for God to do it. Mm. And the Sultan of Turkey had him called up and said, if you really are the Messiah, then do some miracles, and if you can't, either you to convert to Islam, or we'll execute you. And so he couldn't perform the miracles, so they pretended to convert to Islam, and instead they worked on subverting the Turkish government from within, and that was the Young Turks eventually. But the Rothschild family—
Did that become the Ottoman Empire, or is that something different?
That was what undid the Ottoman Empire.
Gotcha.
That became Ataturk. Ataturk was one of their members. Okay. The founder of modern Turkey.
Yeah.
There's hundreds of pages and documents and stuff to back up what I'm saying. I'm not just talking out of the side of my mouth here.
Right.
But the point is that the Rothschilds liked this idea, and so you had this group, this about 1 million member sect, that believes the prophecies are inevitable, they can't be stopped, and they're actively working to carry them out. Mm. This is the really mind-boggling part of it, because it's just, it's just too big and too ridiculous for most people to comprehend, but the evidence is overwhelming. And the point is that these prophecies call for, at the end of they call for a huge battle between two great nations, Gog and Magog, Armageddon.
Right.
And that 90% of humanity would be killed in this battle, and then the remaining 10% would be enslaved by the Jews, who would each have 2,800 slaves. You remember, I've got Jewish ancestry on both sides, so this is not mainstream Jewish thinking. This is this particular sect, okay?
Right. Which would be Sabbatean Jews?
Yeah, Sabbateans, okay. I call them.
Okay.
I don't even call them Jews, because their belief system isn't really Jewish.
Right.
You had Israeli newspapers, okay, and they tried to set up this war between the Soviet Union and the West, which would have done that, and they almost succeeded during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I happened to be living in Cuba at the time, by the way. I was just a baby.
Wow.
But what happened then, and this is where we get into, hard financial history, international financial treaties, stuff that is very well documented in the archives, but basically a lot of the nations of the world said this is crazy, and they wanted something different. I'm going to take you back a bit so people can understand what's happening now and what specific legal actions we're taking against this group of fanatics.
Please do, yeah. I've read the entire 111-page document thoroughly, as if it was a contract I would be signing myself. So when we get to that, I'll be happy to dialogue with you. But go ahead, yeah, do it.
I've been shown many documents related to this that nothing to do with that lawsuit. But essentially, in the 1930s, the Japanese invaded China. And their goal was to take the gold, confiscate the Chinese gold. And
were they still was Japan at that time trying to create what they called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere? Or
yes, but Japan was also still linked to the British. It's complex. But essentially, there was conflicting groups with conflicting goals. You got to remember that it's not a monolithic story. There's different actors with different agendas.
Well, Japan was medieval up until 1877 when Captain Morgan, stormed the Japanese shore with gunboats and basically said "Westernize or die." And then Japan went into an extremely rapid, almost unprecedented industrial growth after that.
Well, it was it wasn't a Captain Morgan, but anyway, the Rothschilds built up Japan as a military colony to use to dominate China.
Okay, beginning in the 1800s,
going right back. I mean,
so as soon as they Westernized, right? Okay. The Meiji families, that was the Meiji Restoration where that all started. The Meijis were apparently kids, right? It was like a youth rebellion. Are you saying that the Rothschilds financed these youths and put them in power?
They took over the southern clans of Satsuma and Choshu and then gave them modern weapons and used them to conquer Japan.
Okay.
Anyway,
right, because Japan was feudal.